So if I talk like this, can everybody at the back hear me? Yes? It's good? Okay. All right, so thank you all for coming to the morning presentation. Like Dan said, I'm going to be giving you a background and the history of psilocybin research from the early 60s until the present. Due to the time constraints here today, I won't be covering any of the brain imaging or neuroscientific work that's been going on with psilocybin. There will be other speakers later on in the day that will be covering those topics. Also, since we're doing a bit of a broad overview, it's unlikely that we'll have time to get into too much of the methodology or going deep into any of the specific lines of research. Just know that there's a lot more depth to go into with any of the lines of research. I'm trying to give you a broad overview, and my presentation is publicly available and has a long list of resources and additional readings and the source articles at the end in case you want to investigate as well, or maybe we'll have time for questions at the end. So we'll begin with the Harvard Psilocybin Project. Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, now known as Ram Dass, were working together and had Ralph Metzner as a graduate student working with them. This is coming out of the introduction of psilocybin mushrooms into the West following the meeting with Maria Sabina and Gordon Wasson reintroducing them, rediscovering that there was still indigenous use of psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico. And we'll start with the Concord prison experiment. So as you saw, this is 1961, and this was part of the Harvard Psilocybin Project. So a team of researchers was evaluating whether psilocybin could be used to reduce the rates of recidivism in prisoners. And from 61 to 63, they did a study with 32 inmates at the Concord prison in Massachusetts. And psilocybin was used to assist group psychotherapy, looking to see whether they could address prisoners' antisocial behaviors. The reported results of the research were optimistic. Average of 10 months after release, Leary reported that treatment had reduced recidivism rates by approximately half. At the last follow-up, however, recidivism rates were now no different than the expected base rates. However, Leary still argued that there was a treatment effect because recidivism rates in the experimental group were due mostly to technical infractions instead of new crimes being committed, which was not the same for the non-treatment group. However, most of you know Rick Doblin, and he will be giving us a presentation later on this evening. He, for his undergraduate research, I believe, did a follow-up to the Concord prison experiment, reanalyzing the data available for 21 to 32 subjects. He discovers that claims of an initial treatment rate effect were false. So a lot of how that research had been reported actually had to do with how Leary had chosen to interpret and present the data, and upon further analysis, there did not seem to be a treatment effect, as you can see there. So for the time being, it seemed to be that there was no meaningful effect on prisoner recidivism. However, in January 2014, there's a new longitudinal study with over 25,000 people under community correction supervision, and it found that psychedelic use among this population resulted in a lower likelihood of supervision failure, which was non-compliance with their supervision requirements at the time. So this line of research has been opened up again recently, and there will be another piece that we'll be looking at soon, which will further expand on that. That said, we can hop to the Good Friday experiment, which is one of my favorites and was really one of the very early research that got started a line of research that's now really taking off. So once again, part of the Harvard Psilocybin Project, Walter Pankey sought to explore if psilocybin could facilitate mystical experiences. First, he had to overcome the hurdle of how to define and how to measure a mystical experience, so he consulted the literature on mysticism and derived several key characteristics which now make up the typology of mystical experiences. This includes a sense of unity. It can be internal unity or external unity. It's transcendence of time and space, deeply felt positive mood, joy, blessedness, sense of sacredness or peace. Paradoxicality, often felt to be, for example, an emptiness which is at the same time full and complete, or the disillusion of the individual and sense of self, yet something remains to experience this state. And ineffability psychedelic experiences are often just referred to as impossible to put words on. And this is really part of the mystical experience more broadly. So 20 theology students with no prior psychedelic experience were recruited. Half were given 30 milligrams of psilocybin, which is a rather high dose, approximately 4 to 6 dried grams, and the rest were given nicotinic acid as a placebo to try to mimic some of the effects of the come-up of psilocybin. However, there's a notorious double-blind problem with psychedelics, which is that you really can't thoroughly double-blind a study on psychedelics. By halfway through the session, it becomes very apparent who did get the active dose and who did not get the active dose. So there are other researchers who argue that double-blind simply is not necessary for doing psychedelic research, and there's been different things that have been tried. We'll see them as we come across them later on. So these 20 theology students were set up in the basement of Boston University's Marsh Chapel during a Good Friday service. This is the Marsh Chapel from the outside and inside. And the participants who took psilocybin scored significantly higher on measures of mystical experience. Most importantly, these effects were not time limited to a couple days or a week or two. 6 months later, participants still self-reported persisting positive changes in their perspectives and in their behaviors resulting from their single experience, which led Pankey to result that psilocybin can induce states of consciousness which are apparently indistinguishable from, if not identical with, those experienced by the mystics according to their own descriptions. So there has also been a long debate as to whether they are genuine mystical experiences or whether they are replicating or are simply indistinguishable to, and this has been a point that has been argued as well. Similarly to the Concord prison experiment, Rick Doblin came in and tracked down to do a follow-up research 25 years later, all but 3 of the experimental subjects of the original study. And 25 years later, the experimental subjects still described their Good Friday psilocybin experience as having had elements of a genuine mystical nature and characterized it as one of the high points of their spiritual life. So here we are starting to see extremely long-lasting effects from psilocybin experiences, which does break away from the paradigm in psychiatry of people being prescribed medications that they generally need to take daily or very regularly. We're starting to see some effects here where several months at least, if not a couple years, is the duration of the effects. So he noted that the experiences had changed very little as a result of the passage of time, and different participants said that it helped them resolve career decisions, recognize the arbitrariness of ego boundaries, increase their depth of faith, increase their appreciation of eternal life, deepen their sense of the meaning of Christ, and heighten their sense of joy and beauty. So right here in this original study and the follow-up, we do see the potential for psilocybin experiences to catalyze one's sense of spirituality, and we're seeing now, results haven't been released yet, but there's currently studies giving psilocybin to long-term meditators as well as to religious leaders following this original line of research. However, like I mentioned earlier, the double blind was broken, so there were some issues with the original study. By the end, all of the participants knew whether they were the psilocybin group or not. The setting was, of course, highly suggestive of spiritual experience, so it would, at this point, remain to be seen whether people would have the same rates of mystical experience in a perhaps drier, more clinical setting. So it is difficult always to determine the contribution of the setting, the suggestion, and the drug. But there was also a significant omission in Pankey's original publication. He actually failed to mention that, well, one of the participants had been divinely inspired. He was in the psilocybin group, and he had been particularly affected by the Good Friday service. He had gone to the pulpit, mumbled something, and blessed the congregation. After failed attempts to get him back inside, he walked into the school of 2014. And what they did is they analyzed all of the data for the high-dose 30 milligram sessions from both studies, and they were looking for increases in the personality domain of openness. This is one of the big five personality domains used in psychology. And openness relates to aesthetic appreciation, sensitivity, fantasy and imagination, awareness of feelings in self and others, intellectual engagement, generally associated with creativity as well. People high in openness are permeable to new ideas and experiences, motivated to enlarge their experience into novel territory. And one thing that is important to note here is it's assumed that people's scores in the big 5 personality domains are going to be stable. This is why they are personality traits. Personality traits are understood to be stable, and this is why this research study was so important, is they observed significant increases in openness which were sustained for at least a year in people who had complete mystical experiences. So this really just points to the fact that we're going to have to look at really what we do believe and understand about personality if we can actually have, again, a single 8-hour lab intervention make a significant change in one of your core personality traits. And we'll see a result from the work that's been done with terminal cancer patients that also suggests that personality is a little more flexible than we've been led to believe. So this is the first study to demonstrate changes in personality in healthy adults after a discrete event. Now, speaking of the terminal illness research, this is a separate line of research that has been using psychedelics to help support people with life-threatening diagnoses who are facing anxiety, depression, chronic pain, and unresolved relationships and family issues. So, initially in the 60s, a group of researchers, Cast and Collins, suggested that the way that LSD made changes to your attention, to your body perception, and your ego boundaries might mean that we could use it to block pain, specifically, to use it as an analgesic. So they designed a study, they gave it to some participants. They found some reductions in pain, also in depression and anxiety, but there were some results in some participants in particular that stood out a lot. They seem to now have what the researchers at the time referred to an apparent disregard for the severity of their condition. So they were no longer just under the full weight of their condition and their diagnosis the whole time, in a way that seemed most beneficial to their own psychic states. So they were in better mental health, they were better able to relate to others around them. And other anecdotal reports and case studies that had used psychedelics with the dying had shown similar results and had suggested that that their use might be more in alleviating psychological suffering. Notably, Aldous Huxley requested LSD on his deathbed. There's a beautiful account of it written by his wife Laura Huxley, which I really recommend that you read. It's incredibly touching. As well in the 60s and 50s, researchers at Maryland Psychiatric Research Center had explored using LSD to alleviate emotional and physical suffering of cancer patients. That research group had also worked a bit with psilocybin. We don't have time to get into it now, but there is a good video online that I linked to at the end that gives a good overview of the Psychiatric Research Center's history. So Charles Grobe at Harbor, UCLA, decided to revive this line of research with 12 adults with advanced stage cancer and end-of-life anxiety. So these are people who not only have a terminal diagnosis, but have significant anxiety and often depression as well as a result of their diagnosis. And this has a significant effect on their quality of life in the last months or years. It's a double-blind placebo-controlled study using niacin as the placebo. They're doing 14 milligrams per 70 kilograms psilocybin, so this is more like 2 to 3.5 grams of dried mushrooms. And one thing you will see throughout the therapeutic sessions with psychedelics is after the preparatory sessions of therapy, during the drug session, the participant is instructed to lie down, put eye shades on, and focus internally on their thoughts, their perceptions, their emotions. So the psychedelic therapy is not a talk therapy session, it's more of an experiential therapy session. You have non-drug therapy sessions beforehand to prepare you for the drug session, and then you have several therapy sessions afterwards for debriefing and processing. So participants are instructed during the drug session to go fully inward. Of course, the therapist team is there if they need any support or interaction, but predominantly the experience is focused internally. And the results were very interesting. They saw a reduction in depression that was sustained for at least 6 months, and also a decrease in trait anxiety sustained at least 6 months. This is the other very interesting finding for personality theory. In psychology, we'll measure anxiety in 2 ways. We'll measure state anxiety, which is your moment-to-moment levels of anxiety, and we'll measure trait anxiety, which is their personality propensity toward anxiety. And this is what they saw a decrease in for at least 6 months. So again, this is showing some flexibility in personality that we might not have supposed initially. So another point was participants suggested future studies should provide an opportunity for a second session that participants felt it would allow them to reinforce and extend the perceived therapeutic effects of the initial session. So these are, on the left-hand side, you have your results for the depression inventory, and on the right-hand side for the trait anxiety inventory. And work that's now being done with LSD has suggested similar results. In 2014, a Swiss researcher used LSD, also same study essentially, to treat anxiety related to life-threatening illnesses, also found a reduction in both state and trait anxiety. So he's supporting this, this unique finding about personality traits. And they're also seeing improvements in quality of life, overall psychological problems, anxiety and depression. And one last follow-up with terminal illness. Now in 2016, the same, this is the Griffiths Research Group at Hopkins, has now done another double-blind study, 51 cancer patients this time, and they're either doing very low placebo-like dose, 1 or 3 milligrams per 70 kilograms, versus a high dose, 22 or 30. And they're showing essentially the same results. High-dose psilocybin produces large decreases in depressed mood and anxiety, along with increases in quality of life, life meaning and optimism, and decreases in death anxiety. These changes are sustained at least 6 months later. About 80% of participants continue to show clinically significant decreases in depressed mood and anxiety. And once again, what I mentioned before, whether they had a mystical experience seems to be mediating these significant effects. So that seems to really make the difference. Two participants could receive 30 milligrams or 20 milligrams. One of them has a mystical experience, the other one doesn't. And whether or not they had the mystical experience seems to be a large indicator of whether or not they show these sustained positive effects, and not just the dose itself. And a similar study coming out from another group in New York University, Ross's group. Once again, they did 29 participants, and they're finding the same effects that we've already reviewed across the board, and also sustained at least half a year later. So we'll wrap up the psychedelics and terminal illness stream there, and we'll move into some of the research that's been looking at psilocybin and drug dependence. So there was a history of using LSD to treat dependence to alcohol and opiates, including a notable Canadian research group coming out of Saskatchewan that was using LSD to treat alcoholism in the 60s. However, a lot of the research that was done in the 50s and 60s just doesn't adhere to the same methodological standards that we have nowadays for research. So what two Norwegian researchers did in 2012 is they took all of the double-blind studies, so the most rigorously designed studies of the 50s and 60s, and did a meta-analysis of those studies that had used LSD to treat alcoholism, and found that LSD approximately doubled success rates at the first follow-up session afterwards compared to those that did not get LSD. So one line of research that we've seen in the present day that I'll talk about shortly is the use of psilocybin for smoking cessation. So just to give you a bit of a sense of proportion of the issue here, there's about close to 500,000 smoking-related deaths in the US every year, and 5 million worldwide. And significant costs to healthcare and society as a result of cigarette smoking. And current interventions for smoking cessation have about a third of a success rate, let's say about 30 to 35%. So a team at Johns Hopkins, led by Matt Johnson, set out to see whether psilocybin could be used to treat tobacco addiction. With 15 psychiatrically healthy nicotine-dependent smokers who together had an average of 6 lifetime quit attempts and an average of 19 cigarettes per day for 31 years. So these were the high end of daily smokers. And they did 3 administrations of moderate and high doses, 20 and 30 milligrams. Once again, roughly 3 to 5 and 4 to 6 dried grams. And they did that as part of a 15-week protocol for smoking cessation. And results were, after 6 months, 80% of the participants, that's 12 out of 15, were abstinent, as compared to around 35 for existing interventions. 73% rated at least one of their sessions as the 5 most spiritually significant experiences in their life. 87 reported that their personal well-being or life satisfaction had increased very much as a result of these sessions. And participants themselves said that it helped them quit by changing how they prioritize their values in life so that reasons to smoke no longer outweigh reasons to quit, by strengthening your belief that you have the ability to quit and stay quit, and by changing the way you orient yourself concerning the future such that you now act in your long-term holistic benefit rather than acting in response to immediate desire. So this is one of the first findings, present day, using psychedelics to help people quit an addiction, but we are now seeing similar research with alcohol, and we are also seeing research with cocaine. There's been a follow-up to this research. 12 and 16 plus months later, we're still seeing people, 10 and 9 respectively, are still abstinent from an original group of 15. So these findings suggest that it has considerable promise in promoting long-term smoking abstinence. Remember that conventional treatments for smoking cessation at the 6-month mark have about 35% success rate, and here we're seeing a year and a third, close to a year and a half later, 60%. So, of course, it bears mentioning that this is a small-scale study. They used 15 people initially, but this is, very promising results and really warrants future research being done on this. Now, with regards to psychedelics and mental health more broadly, there's been some research published in the last couple of years. While not specific to psilocybin, it does really contextualize and help to understand some of the effects of these substances. So there's been a couple population studies that have been quite important. This is by the 2 Norwegian researchers that I just mentioned, did the meta-analysis of the work using LSD for alcoholism. The same group published 2 population studies, each with over 130,000 respondents and about 20 to 22,000 psychedelic users in each group, finding no significant associations between lifetime use of any psychedelics and increased rate of any of the mental health outcomes. In several cases, psychedelic use was associated with lower rates of mental health problems. Mental health outcomes that they were looking for included depression, included anxiety, included suicidal thinking or planning or attempts. It bears mentioning, it has been a point of debate for a long time whether psychedelics cause psychosis or schizophrenia. The results from these population studies would suggest that on a population-wide level they do not, but Krebs and Johansson do make a clear point in their article that it may very well be the case that for some individuals they do indeed have such adverse effects, but that on a large population level any of those events are offset or balanced by the broad positive level, and so you wouldn't see an overall trend. And then again from the 2015 study, also no significant associations between psychedelic use and increased likelihood of psychological distress, mental health treatment, suicidal thoughts, suicidal plans, and suicidal attempts, or depression and anxiety. And similarly, another research team has also been doing population studies using the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. This is 191,000 adults, and found that lifetime classical psychedelic use is associated with a significantly reduced odds of past month psychological distress, suicidal thinking, suicidal planning, and suicide attempt in the past year. Following analysis of that same data that broke down different users by which psychedelics they had used, found that psilocybin itself among the entire group of the classical psychedelics that they're looking at may have the greatest therapeutic potential. So, in addition to these lines of research, which had mostly focused on the mystical experience and the spirituality side of it, and the specific treatment for terminally ill patients and for depression and anxiety, we've seen some research come out recently that is hinting more at pro-social effects of psychedelics rather than strictly the therapeutic effects. So a longitudinal study, this is what I mentioned earlier, with 25,000 people found that those with who had used hallucinogens had a reduced likelihood of supervision failure, were less likely to not comply with the legal requirements of their supervision, And that does give some weight to the initial line of research that Tim Leary had started in the 60s for recidivism. And this really goes in line with that as well. So this was a study of 302 men aged 17 to 40 serving time in prison, and 42% of those who did not take psychedelic drugs were arrested within 6 years for domestic battery, compared to 27% of those who had taken. So there was a significantly less, those who had taken psychedelics were significantly less likely to be arrested again for domestic violence. That was a study that came out last year from University of British Columbia, and it's now featured actually on Policy Horizons Canada, which is a government website that tracks just emerging changes in science and technology. And they made this point that this new study challenges the prevailing focus on the harms and risks of psychedelic substances and speaks to a potential expanded range of unexpected therapeutic effects, including pro-social ones. And these sorts of findings could stimulate more nuanced discussions about drug use and augment public support for legalizing illicit drugs beyond cannabis. So I just think that that's wonderful that that research is featured on the Government of Canada's website, suggesting that that could go towards a bit of a more sensible conversation on legalizing substances. And recently this year now we've had a study published, 2017 population study with 1,487 people online, and it's self-report as well, of course, so keep that in mind, suggesting that people who had used classical psychedelics are more likely to self-report pro-environmental behaviors. Two that they gave examples of were saving water and recycling, and that this is mediated by the person's sense of connectedness with nature. Now, the researchers do publish there was a far larger list than just saving water and recycling, but the general idea is that, well, these are some of the more pro-social effects of psychedelics that we're seeing in populations, that it really seems to just affect their sense of connectedness with nature and with their surroundings, and that this change in perception and experience seems to bleed into their behavior. I believe after this we actually may be wrapping up a little earlier than I thought. So I'll take a moment to just let you know that, as I mentioned earlier, it is a broad overview. There's a lot of work and a lot more depth that you could go into this research. So if you are interested, my presentation is available online. I think my website should be in the bio, but if not, it's just my first name, last name.ca, gonzonieto.ca. So if you want to just go through the website presentation on your own at your own pace, very welcome to do so. And there's a huge list of additional reading and sources at the end. I've included the original articles, some video presentations, so on. So for anybody who has some questions. But apart from that, that's it. So if you have any questions. Yeah.
The graph you showed on the reduction of depression.
Sorry?
The graph for reduction of depression in cancer patients.
Yeah.
Like first it goes down and then it goes down again.
No, I don't know. But the one that you were seeing, the question was just about the findings for a decrease in the depression inventory in cancer patients, why there was a first initial decrease and then a follow-up decrease. I'm not sure. The second decrease was the 6-month follow-up. Yeah. Anybody else with questions? Yeah. Sorry, 1 second. Can everybody just quiet down a little bit so I can hear the question? Thank you. Can you say again? Sorry.
Right. There is a common idea that if you have a latent predisposition to schizophrenia, or what you label as schizophrenia, and psychosis, then psychedelic-assited could actually, exacerbate it.
Yes.
And I was wondering if there has been any research to disprove it, or has there been any research on therapy for people who would be categorized as such? And the second question, smaller, where do you think are the 3 people who are missing from the Good Friday experiment? What's up with them?
I'm not sure. One of the ones that was missing was the guy who went up on the pulpit and was given Thorazine, though. They couldn't get him again. So the question was about that we often hear that psychedelics can exacerbate or bring out latent psychosis or schizophrenia, and that's what your question was about? Yeah. I don't have the citation on hand, but there was a review done of the people that showed up to psychiatric wards in the 50s and 60s as a result of LSD, and they found that the vast majority of the people who did already had a pre-existing mental health condition prior to their psychedelic use. It wasn't like a completely normal, healthy, undiagnosed person who took psychedelics and just sort of lost it. But yes, that is one of the criteria by which they'll actually filter people out, is any psychosis, or often family history of schizophrenia will be just something to at least be very mindful about, because it could be latent. And the thing is, you will see, like, if you haven't yet, I would suggest the work of Stanislav Grof, who's a Czechoslovakian psychiatrist who did a lot of pioneering research with psychedelics. Include his book, LSD Psychotherapy, is a very good read. LSD, Doorway to the Numinous, is another one as well. And he did do some sessions with patients who had psychosis, and it's not that it's unworkable, it's just that it requires another order of ability to take care and spend time with that person depending on what that experience brings up for them. So most often those cases are filtered out, but it's not that they can't benefit from the experiences. That the care and support that needs to be provided is often on a different order, and it's just simply not what these studies are looking at right now. Yeah.
In many of the studies that were conducted with mystical experiences,
Yeah.
in the point to something or point to the reading that defines mystical experience, and you go talk a little more about the pre-trial before they gave them psilocybin, they were being done.
Like the non-drug therapy sessions?
The non-drug therapy sessions. That built them up towards the mystical experience. Just explain that more in that fully. And the books that define what the mystical experience is.
So your question is twofold, right?
Yeah.
Then the first one is, how did they define mystical experience?
Yeah.
And the second one is, what can I say about the sessions, the non-drug therapy sessions leading up to a session? Okay. From my understanding, I might be mistaken, but from my understanding, in the Good Friday experiment, I don't think that they had non-drug therapy sessions in preparation. Okay, so for the definition of mystical experience, what Panke did was he reviewed like the writing of the mystics throughout very many different religions and cultures. And through a sort of qualitative analysis of those texts, tried to dilute and define what seemed to be, across cultures, across times, across religious traditions, what seemed to be the core characteristics that we see show up again and again when the mystics are talking about their experiences. Does that kind of define your question? I mean, if you look up like Panke's work, his PhD thesis is what we were talking about. It's available online, and he describes like all of his all of his research and what he drew from. The non-drug therapy sessions are in most of these studies you have a therapy dyad, which again most of the time is one male, one female therapist. And yes, you have several sessions with them to establish rapport, get to know them, and for them to get to know you, and what might be significant aspects of your life that could be coming up in this experience. Yeah, they just try to answer any questions that you have and give you an idea of what you might expect. Really just set you up in a good place, let you know what the session is going to go, how it's going to go down. Just make sure that when you show up on the day of the session, there isn't like 50 questions to go through, and you can just kind of go into the experience and have an idea and feel safe as well. So. At the back. No, not in one study. With the mystical experience stuff, we've seen the Good Friday experiment had it in a pretty spiritually or religiously suggestive setting, whereas the current research on mystical experience is more of, I believe there was a photo earlier, it just kind of looks like a really comfortable living room. But no, to my knowledge, there's not been a current study that has taken a group and given them a similar dose in different settings, for example, to explore that effect. Or varied, one session with one sitter, one session with two different sitters, things like that really been looked at yet. I know that with MDMA, I'm pretty sure MAPS right now is looking into establishing protocols where the therapists that are going to be working with MDMA can actually have an MDMA experience beforehand, so that they can have some personal experience. But that's totally outside the paradigm of how we've been doing psychiatry and medicine. So it's it really pushes the envelope a bit. One more? Okay, there you go.
A lot of the comments of the people in studies is that there's development firmly into the bond, so that it's a relationship with God.
Right.
Information about those people going into it, were they religious, without religious, were they spiritual, were they agnostic, were they without atheists, and how many of them went from shifting from, let's say, atheist or agnostic to doing the further connection with their religion?
Right. That is a good question. The Good Friday experiment recruited students from Harvard Divinity School. So they all had some spiritual or religious predisposition. I can't recall with 100% confidence, but I don't think that was the case for the contemporary research on mystical experience. But yeah, there's quite a bit of research just showing that you know, on the one hand, psychedelic experiences can bolster somebody's faith in their existing religion. Like there's a book Charles Grobe wrote. He's the one doing some of the end-of-life studies. And one of the first chapters is a collection of interviews with Jewish rabbis. 3 of them, who remain anonymous, I think, but who all spoke about it like reawakening or reaffirming their faith in a time of serious doubt in their career. There's also a book called Zigzag Zen that talks about the relationship between psychedelics and Buddhism, and has quotes from a lot of Buddhists for whom it either propelled them along their path or got them to the path initially. But no, most directly, I'd suggest looking more into the original articles for that. Yeah. How are we for time? One more? Or done. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody.